Hello, everyone. Welcome to NRDNA. We're going to get started in a moment. We'll start with introductions, and whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, whatever platform, we're glad to have you here. We have some very special guests tonight. We'll start with some intros. First, I'll introduce Dr. Janina Jeff, the host of In Those Genes podcast. How you doing tonight, Janina? Oh, we can't hear you.
I'm doing well, but I'm also on mute. How are you?
Doing well. So we're going to talk about episode 2 of In Those Genes podcast tonight, where you had 2 special guests. Would you care to introduce the guests of the podcast?
Yes. So episode 2 is called Black to the Future. We recorded this episode under the guise of time and space travel. And our goal here was to understand how we developed our phenotypes. And so for those of you who were with us 2 weeks ago when we discussed episode 1, the opener for this season, we were focused on the genetics of race. And so we wanted to, we talked about how race was created and how race is used today. But we also wanted to make sense of the phenotypes that are commonly associated with race. And so in order to do that, the lead producer, Sam, and I had this crazy idea of let's do a time travel episode. And so I called up Tina and was like, hey, girl, you study hair and skin. Please come and space travel with me. And she politely said, sign me up. Let's get on this spaceship. And then through our guest from last week, Saida Grundy, I met Brandon, who also works in this space. And I hit up Brandon and was like, would you come and space travel with me? And so these 2 were down for it. I think we recorded this, I don't know, sometime during the week at like 7, 8 o'clock at night. And we're on recording for, I think, almost 3 hours. But it was an amazing experience. So without further ado, this is Dr. Tina Lasisi and Dr. Brandon Akuno.
Hey.
Peace.
Awesome. Glad to have you. I'm also joined by my co-founder, Misha. We're the co-founders of Kinkofa. Hey, Misha, how's it going?
Wonderful. How are y'all? So I have a question for y'all that's so unrelated but related, because why not? So yesterday was the Negro solstice. So I'm wondering what superpowers y'all might be hiding or having over there. Jordan, what power you get?
The premonitions have been strong over here, so little premonition power.
Premonition. Yeah. I can't say anything quite like that. I just do myself a big party for the end of the semester, and which is why my camera is muddy right now, y'all. I have there's some chicken grease and some and things from a celebration. So it was more just celebrating Black life and surviving another, in my case, the unit of time this semester.
I wish I had planned better, because like last year I was on it. I had all the Hotep memes loaded. I had the Kofi hat photoshopped in every photo. I had my friends had taught me how to like master making it look like you flying and stuff. I had all things. This year I completely forgot, because I'm kind of not a person right now. But I guess my superpower, you know what? I'll share this. I feel like I'm learning random facts about the genome in Black people, and I'll share what I learned last night. Mm-hmm. That might be an old fact for Brandon and Tina, but it was a new fact for me. Mm-hmm. So I learned that the current human genome reference that we're using, the assembly, 70% of it is built off of one Black man who donated who volunteered to be a part of the Human Genome Research Project back in 2000, or maybe even earlier than that, 1999. So his bacterial artificial chromosome clones basically represent 70% of the human genome reference assembly. And I was like, wow. I mean, this is problematic, but also a random Black history fact that I kind of wish I knew.
I didn't know that. Like, is he like African American, or did they just pluck one of the Yoruba out of their samples?
No, he's a random Black man who responded to an ad in the Buffalo Exchange article to join.
He's a Buffalo.
Yeah, he a Buffalo Negro, exactly. And I mean, and it's crazy because no one bothered to look at his ancestry until 2010. And they found his ancestry by a paper that was looking at it was the first sequence of the Neanderthal genome, and it's hide deep in the supplement table, his ancestry. And they find out that he's European and African American, and many understand him to be African American. So anyway, his sample number is RF11. So shout out to RF11 and his superpowers. But it's crazy how much Black people have contributed to the sequencing of the human genome. It's just crazy to me.
Incredible.
Oh, I guess I should talk about my superpower. Honestly, I got the power to make it through another day, and that's all I ever ask.
And you're a TikTok celebrity. Don't forget to drop that.
I'm absolutely not a TikTok celebrity.
That's
It
real.
totally is. It's fine.
That's real. So you kind of answered some of the first question that I was going to throw out there, Janina. But I'm kind of curious what you wanted people to come away with in this first episode about phenotype.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main goal that we wanted was for people to understand and delineate how phenotypes are developed. So one, what is a phenotype? Which was, the tentative title of the season, but we just do that, like, what is a phenotype? And we were going to call it WAP. But, a year has passed. Nobody cares about that song anymore. So we didn't do that. But anyway, we wanted to make sure people understand, one, what a phenotype, two, how and why phenotypes develop, and then three, how long do those processes take? And this came from the idea that people associate things that are commonly called race with these phenotypes and believe that this has something to do with culture versus understanding the relationship that our phenotypes, or how our phenotypes are developed out of a responsive environment. And so I really wanted to, and culture, but the ones that we're talking about mostly around the environment. So I wanted everyone to have an understanding of what that is. And so that when someone asks a listener, well, what is the genetics of race? They're able to further break that down and understand when someone, the subsequent question you normally get, okay, race is not a social construct. But then why do we have different skin colors, right? Why do we have different, really kind of re-emphasizing and bringing that all in. Uh-oh, I can't hear you, Jordan. I don't know if you're talking.
I'll go ahead and ask you. So one of the big things I guess Jordan wanted to know, what are some ways that y'all prepare for these episodes?
I can say I over-prepared, like with everything else. I started reading tons of things and I was like, how am I going to prop as much nuance as possible? And then I talked to Brandon and I was like, but how am I going to talk about this? And what about that? And what about this? And what about that? And you just told me to fucking chill the fuck out. And I said words and people like the words, it seems. So.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, I found out who was going to be on there. It was kind of like cheating on an exam when you were in grade school. You find out who's sitting next to you in the exam, and that dictates how much you prepare. When I knew Dr. Lassisi was going to be sitting next to me in this exam, I just had a drink and logged on, and I had a ball.
So for us, we actually do quite a bit of prep before an episode. So by the time Tina and Brandon joined us, we already have a pretty much an outline of where we want to go. And so our map for this episode was all centered around how human populations migrated out of Africa. So we knew where we were starting, and then we knew where we were going. What we didn't know at the time was, one, how much fun we were going to have. I should have bought drinks that night. We had so much fun. I don't know. Y'all hear glimpses of it, but it was 3 hours of pure trying not to cuss on here. It's a good old time. Can I cuss on here? I don't know. We had a good old time.
You were cussing all over the podcast, so if they listen to
Yeah,
that.
I guess so. We had a good time. I mean, from the beginning when we were trying to teach Tina how to play spades, all the way until the end, we were talking about humanhood. We just had like a really good time. But we did have some common questions that we were trying to ask, and there were some particular phenotypes that we wanted to make sure that we addressed. And of course, the main one being skin color and hair. But we really wanted to focus on physical features, particularly in the face. And so you hear us talk about, certain things like a brow ridge and where we inherit that from if people have one. You hear us talk about skin color, hair, different climates, how people moved, how they got from one place to another. You also hear people talk about, you hear us talk about, I should say, the different hypotheses of how people got there. And so we come in with an outline of what we think the show should sound like. And then when we talk to our guests, you guys add in so many facts and things we didn't think about. And then if anybody has ever met Sam, the expert genius behind all of this, we talk about the creative process of how to bring this to life to make it sound more of a story within a story. And so in this episode, you hear over 15 different voice actors acting out and playing up the scenes where we travel. Now, the funny thing is that was recorded much later than this interview. So one of the challenging parts post-production was trying to make Brandon and Tina sound like they were at the places where the voice actors were. And so you'll hear in a lot of those parts, I kind of come in and I'm like, Tina, why is it so cold out here? Brandon, why? You hear that mac and cheese?
So I'll hopefully Jordan can hear now. Talk about some of the takeaways that we had, which is like a completely different connection, but we were really just thinking about the connection between the last episode and this episode. And I think one of the big ones for me, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, was really just how long it's been. Like, I guess the time frame, like, because I know you all were time traveling for a long time, but just like, I'm like, dang, humans are really like the same in a way, like more advanced, but not. Like some of the same misconceptions, and really just thinking back to the episode, the last episode, and the whole thing with blackness being the result of a mole taking over your whole skin, which still is, I can't even. But that's one of, I guess, my big ones, and then we'll get into some other connections I have for that. But I think one of the stories I'll tell you in a little bit is my first time that I went to Africa, so it's almost 10 years, and just kind of the reaction to being called fair skinned for the first time is I'm like, I'm not, no part of me is fair, but trying to figure out like those kind of things. We'll talk more about that. Jordan, you have a takeaway before we get into the next part?
Yeah. Well, one, there was really a vast timeline and just seeing how long things take to change, which was actually a point from the last talk that we had. Just the longer or the more things change, the more they stay the same. But what I really liked was one, the call out to another point from the previous episode, which was the lack of agency. It was kind of in bits and pieces of the episode, because really the episode was about why we look the way we look, which for me is also another interesting question, because I, as a genealogist and family historian, am curious in how we got here. And I think that that's adding additional context, very long-term context to that question. But I think the question or the point around a lack of agency was introduced again in this episode, and one that I want to ask of a more recent timeline. So we looked at roughly 200,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago or so in different parts of the world, different groups of people. And I think that it's interesting to think about how, one, those experiences shape ours today, and how a lack of agency also plays a part in that. So there were some interesting parts just beyond thinking about why we look the way we look, but also how it affects the way we live our lives. So,
Tina and Brandon, quick question. What were y'all's takeaways, or like, what did y'all learn anything new that you didn't already know, or tell us more about that.
Brandon, you talk, because when I talk, I never stop. Oh, wow, you're really going to play chicken. Okay, fine. So, I mean, I think what really was the takeaway for me is that it's hard to give one kind of coherent tale of human history, right? So, like, honestly, the entire premise of let's talk about us, let's talk about Black people. And at the same time, you know, we say Black people are not a monolith. And that is so incredibly true. Like, Janina, like, talked for a little bit about Melanesians, and Melanesians and Australian Aboriginal people, they are Black. Like, that is how they are racialized. But they are also no more closely related to Africans than other non-Africans. And so that is like one of the examples that I always think of, you know, how do we tell this coherent story about it? How do we say something that speaks to and counters all the ways in which Blackness has been demonized without essentializing it again and turning Black people into a monolith? And I don't know that I ever really got an answer to that. But what has been really interesting is, like, you know, with this episode and just in general talking about this stuff more, it's having these conversations, because conversations and, you know, being able to, you know, dream and research and ask these questions of, like, you know, how did humans evolve and how did we evolve? And then we not being old white men, that is, you know, fun, and it's a privilege. And I want more people to be able to do that, because all of the stories that we've told you, you know, to a large extent, they are hypotheses. They are ideas. They're a current understanding based on the data. This is what we think what happened. But when you add more people to science, they're going to see things that you didn't notice. And then they're going to say, hey, I actually think that maybe this happened. So, yeah, I just feel like it was a great start to something I hope continues.
Briefly, what I'll say is that I think there are two things that are simultaneously true about the forces of evolution that are operating at the same time. On one end, it's the most powerful algorithm, I think, in the universe in terms of what it's been able to solve and the problems that it solves over and over and over again. And we're now living in the midst. This is why we're not doing this in person, for example, right? Because of the powers of adaptive evolution. But when you look at human evolution, and this kind of played out in the episode, It's really a story of wanderlust and war and mistakes and accidents and travel and love and lust and people. It's mistake. And that's the story of Homo sapiens. And we just kind of have to get over it. And I think with a lot of kind of human biological, evolution as it pertains to studying, it is trying to kind of create a very neat and clean picture of what the species is. When in fact, that's just not the story of the species. Now, that doesn't mean we settle for not knowing. That means that we have to kind of learn that what understanding human beings really is this kind of long tail, 10 to 15,000 generations tops, which in one sense is a long time, in another sense is not, to be honest with you, depending on how you look at it. That's actually not that many generations, but from another lens. And so reconciling kind of these apparently contradictory ideas about the way evolution works, I think that played out very, very nicely in the episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, there were some deeper questions that I didn't even know the answer to that I learned from these two. One of the questions were kind of about our interactions with Neanderthals and other hominid species, and the idea of did they also originate in Africa and or not? And so, kind of to Brandon's point, one, I had no idea of, we call it the L's everybody took along the way. The L's were so large. Like, there were so many L's, and I know there were so many that we didn't even talk about. But particularly the L's that our hominid cousins took, the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. And also learning about, we call her Mama Mitochondria or Mitochondrial Eve, learning about her story, their story, but also learning that that may not have been the first modern day Homo sapien. This is just the first one that we know of. Just making sense of the migration patterns. I think a lot of my original thinking was that it was somewhat this linear thing. People just walked outside of Africa, just never came back. But it sounds like, I mean, from what I learned, that it actually was a continuously flowing thing. So it wasn't just the out of Africa hypothesis, it was the in and out of Africa and all the L's you caught along the way hypothesis. And there was so much to be gained. Another fascinating thing we talked about that I really enjoyed learning about was the everyone who has talked about this path and follow the different traces of how humans migrated out of Africa into other parts of the world kind of have these different theories of which way did people go, when, and where. And particularly the last part where we go quote unquote to the Americas. How did that happen? And I think it was you, Tina, who kind of mentioned to us the indigenous stories that have been passed down that don't actually quite nicely align with what scientists think in terms of humans coming through the Bering Strait. And so just also learning that this is a draft of what we think happened, but no one really knows. But I think one thing we want people to understand about that, and I hope that COVID is making this easier, is that science is constantly changing. And we are constantly learning. So we have a good idea that this is likely what happened, and there's strong evidence to support it. But we're learning more and more things every day. So there's parts of the story that, could be missing. And I think it's quite beautiful that those parts of the story come in. It's no different from how we talked last week of getting or I don't know if we talked about this last week, I might be making this up, getting your genetic ancestry results and those things changing, right? So I think just to kind of reiterate how dynamic this process is. And I don't know, that was really dope.
I was going to bring this up later, but this is a question. We're going to switch it up just a bit. But on the note of science changing all the time and taking ancestry tests or consumer DNA tests, whatever we want to call it, and I know we talked about this, we touched on it a little bit last time, but I know one of the biggest questions we get too is like, let's dive into that just a bit. What does it mean when you get those results? So, like maybe phenotypically you're lighter skinned, but then you get your results back and it's like you're 99% Nigerian. So we want to dive into that just a bit, and we'll go ask about that. And then another thing with that is, what does it mean when those estimates are always changing?
So I think that that's actually really interesting. It ties into one of the discussions that I've been having over and over again on social media on people saying, like, race is phenotypic. Just because race is not genetic doesn't mean that it is phenotypic. It is simultaneously both and neither. And that's why people are so affected by these tests, because race above all is taxonomy. Like, we want to classify all of life. We still do. We want to classify all of human beings, and we like coherent classifications. So if you look a particular way, your ancestry has to be a particular way, or we're going to poke holes in it and explain why actually your ancestry isn't that. You see that all the time on the internet. People will be like, well, you can't be African, or you can't be European. Like, you want to deny your blackness, or you want to claim blackness that's not yours. And that just goes to show how people really want these two things to like go together all the time. But there's like a lot of different factors. So first of all, there's the fact that, as a Nigerian, albeit half Nigerian, and see, I have to say that because people will look at me and be like, well, what do you mean? But my father is Yoruba from Nigeria. And when you do these genetic tests, they compare you to modern day populations. So any, African Americans whose ancestors have been in the Americas for hundreds of years, they're being compared to people who are literally my very close cousins, probably. And that comparison isn't exactly right, because they're obviously not your ancestors, right? So what that test is telling you is how similar you are to those people, really compared to all of the other people that they have in their samples. But Yoruba people are not the only people in Nigeria. There's Igbo, there's Hausa, there's tons of other tribes that rarely get spoken about. And they all have a huge range of like phenotypic variation. So it could be that a person is getting a higher, percentage of similarity because that's the closest thing they have in the sample, but actually those people that they're really closely related to don't look that way. And then there's like the technical aspect of it, which is we as a lot of people, these companies don't use your entire genome. They don't use all your DNA. That's too expensive. You're not fancy like that. You're not Craig Venter. They will take some parts of your genome and they'll say, okay, well, these are the parts of the genome that we can use really well to put people into boxes. And based off of those, they'll say, okay, this is the group that you're in. But the parts of your DNA that they pick to make that decision are based, and Janina, correct me if I'm wrong, but mostly on what's been successful on distinguishing different Europeans. I actually have a funny story about that because I've done my 23andMe, and I was disappointed to find out that my parents have never lied to me. They're exactly who they said they were, and I'm exactly what I expected to be. However, my mother is Bulgarian. In 23andMe, they could tell from the beginning that I was from, that region, and then when they improved it, at this very moment, they can tell the literal fucking village that my mother's family is from, and they give me the entire country of Nigeria on my dad's side. So that is the level of resolution that you're getting. Like, it's just not useful at all, and that will improve. But as a lot of people have said, like, don't hang your entire identity off of this. Also because your genetic ancestry doesn't reflect all of your ancestors.
Janina, can you break down Tina's last comment?
Oh, it's so funny you should mention that because I think she's throwing a hint at another person who we know who's doing this research. But anyway, yes. So there have been some researchers who have found that you cannot, basically, if you look at your genealogy over multiple generations, that there are some ancestors' DNA that you will not find in your DNA. And so because of that, it actually is not a complete picture of your genetic ancestry. Although I will say, I don't know how rare that is. I do think it's probably not common, but it happens. And so you see that, hold on, you see that certain people, I can't remember, there is an average, and I can send that later, but there's an average of like, I think 1 to 3 that could be missing out of the last 5 or 6 generations. Anyway, that being said, then that means that all of your ancestors that are reported to you in 23andMe are not the complete picture. Um, Another thing to kind of keep in mind of kind of adding on to what Tina said is that these methods are constantly changing. Back when this first started, as you guys, and I think everyone who's probably listening right now are pretty familiar that we weren't even using all of the genome. We were using a tiny small fraction of the genome that told us about an ancient part of our ancestors versus our more recent common ancestors, which people are more interested in. But what does that even mean when you're looking at modern day humans? What does that even mean when you are, and I'm probably not the blame for this, but this is what I do for a living. When you are selecting markers in the genome, a subset of markers in the genome to kind of display genetic ancestry, right? It's a very glimpse at your genetic ancestry versus a full picture of it. And so that being said, better technology like whole genome sequencing is far too expensive, but it will be coming. Maybe a little bit closer is something we call low pass sequencing. But either way, looking at every single letter in your genome is going to be a much more accurate way of looking at your genealogy and your genetic ancestry, but it will never be 100%. It will, it just will never be 100%. Even if we have everybody sequenced in the entire world, which is unlikely, it still probably would not be 100%. So that's really important to know. I think the other thing that what do you do? There are going to be some instances where your genetic ancestry may not align with the stories that you've been told. So your verbal history. One of the things I say I like so much about kinkofa is that we talk about family history in a very broad context, right? It's your family, it's your community, it's your culture, it's your ethnicity, it's all of these things pieced together that really make up your family history and your identity.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, what I'll quickly say to answer the question and go back to something that Tina said about what does it mean, I think part of the answer is what is the answer that you're looking for when you actually get your DNA sequenced. I think that there's a lot of beautiful and amazing information in the genome, even the stuff we're getting now. The problem is you're not going to find about who you are in that information. Like we just described, that's a comprehensive question. And everyone in this room has their own definition for who they are and why they're proud to be Black. And so that's one that no genome, however perfectly sequenced and however granular, will ever give you.
Yeah, just to add on to what Brandon said, I don't want to make any enemies here, but the way I treat these genetic reports is kind of like a genetic birth chart. It's genetic astrology in some ways for fun, and if you hated Aquarians, for example, like you're still going to hate them if you find them all over your birth chart. Same with your genetic report, whatever it is that you think you are or what's important to you, you can explain it away or you can make it make sense. At the end of the day, that is not really something that should affect you, because to some extent, I don't know if they even explicitly say it, they used to, but these things are meant for entertainment. Whether they do that because they don't want to get sued, or whether they actually believe it is another question, but that is very much how you should treat it. Like, do not change your identity based off of what you read in the genetic report.
Uh-oh, Jordan, we can't hear you. I don't know if you muted. I'm not sure what happened.
Okay, I think he's fixing his sound. But I know one thing that I'm just going to dig into that just a little bit more, because I know some people in our community will they'll have more questions. So I know that one thing is, some of us have been able to find like our living African relatives, depending on, I think for us, we are, I won't say all of us, but there's a portion of us where that is the most important thing, is that they want to know. But like, I guess one of my biggest takeaways, and I'll just share a bit of an antecedent, is that, before moving to Africa, I was always like, oh, I have cousins all over the world. Like Black people are my cousins wherever they are. Like I didn't really care what it lined up to be until I went to Africa and people were like claiming me from different places. Oh, you look like, my cousin here in Seychelles, or you look like my cousin from Mozambique. And when, for me, when I landed in Rwanda for the first time, so I think it was January 2012, it was the first time I saw women who were like really built like me, like legs, like, kind of small up top, but then like big calf muscles and everything. And I was just like, okay, like I'm definitely from here. Like these are my people. But then, went to Kenya, and then it was like, okay, you look like these people over here, but then go to West Africa and then get called fair skinned and like, okay, like I'm not, like I'm brown. And then I had to have this reflection that like, okay, looking at it, I'm fairer than the darkness in you, but like I don't like the association. But like my skin tone relatively is fairer than yours. So like just taking it to unpacking like what it means to live in a racialized society versus places where that's not what you're known by. And so I'm realizing that they're looking, at certain things about me versus, I don't know, like race. When everybody's Black, what does it mean when you are? So, and another thing, so when I did my DNA test, I had a lot of friends that like, it really was a joke for me. I'm like, there's other things I wanted to learn. I was mostly interested in like finding the family members that were separated from us during slavery, and just migrations of any kind. But one of the things is my friends in Africa really wanted me to take it so they could see who was right about like which one I would have like the most ancestry from. And so for years, and I grew up in Texas, so people were always like, oh, you look Evo or whatever it is. And so I just thought it's because I was lighter skinned that they were saying that. And like, or, guys being like, oh, you're South African because I have a, bigger lower half. But just making those kind of like phenotypic, I guess, like assumptions based on that. But saying, getting my results and saying that, it says I'm 96% African and 43% Nigerian. And then like, okay, maybe there is some truth to like what you're seeing in me. Maybe you can tell, maybe you can't, I don't know. But that was one thing for me. And then I had another question for y'all. Do y'all have any phenotypic nicknames that your family has given y'all?
Oh my God, I'm from New Orleans. So Jordan, I don't know if you even caught on to this, but in New Orleans, we have so many nicknames for light-skinned people. It's ridiculous. So most of my family calls me Red, which that's what people call you in New Orleans, is stay red. That people niggas trying to holler, that's their go-to. Okay. But then my family calls me Red. And they call me now Dr. Red, because we gotta be politically correct. They also call me Fall, which I don't know if that's connected to skin color or the fact that I'm actually born in the summer, technically September, but September hits and everybody calls it fall. Yeah, I'm trying to think of some others. In college, I was called Redbone Bandit. It used to be my Twitter name, but there's a story behind that. Anyway, yes. So I have a few.
Wow. I got no nicknames that good. But to the first point, thank you for sharing that story about your personal history. By the way, I thought that was extremely, and I want to kind of emphasize, DNA testing has been extremely powerful in my family as well. So I'm actually in the team that it does help you sort out some things about yourself. And I have a deeply fractionated family history. I have a Nigerian father who I do not know. I am completely disconnected from my Nigerian side. And so, and I think that's, and my African-American mother is also disconnected from most of her family. So I found it deeply empowering, right? You know, so to kind of run my story parallel to yours. In terms of phenotypic nicknames, number one, that's an odd phrase. I've never heard that term before. Phenotypic nickname. We got nicknames. People snap on me for having a big head and shit. But like, I don't know about a pheno. I guess that's a phenotypic nickname.
It is. Does your family says because your brain is big?
Well, I mean, it was a lot of burden to do real smart people stuff in the world. So, you know what I'm saying? Hopefully I've, I got to get a Nobel Prize to, you know what I'm saying, to account for for this dome.
Right.
So, I mean, I can say more about mine, but like, I need everybody to like get the context that I grew up in Europe. So, Misha, actually, my experience is probably like, you know, in some ways like the opposite of yours. You know, going to Africa and being called light skinned. I mean, like growing up in Europe. I don't know if you've ever seen Dutch people, but they're pretty Aryan is the word that comes to mind. And so, you know, coming to the US especially, like people literally like can't wrap their heads around it, whether they're white people or black people, that people ever refer to me as dark skinned. I am 2 shades away from mayonnaise, objectively. That is just a fact. That is just a fact. Yet, when I grew up, I remember I was trying to bleach my skin because I just didn't want them to pick on me anymore. And so I was called everything but a child of God. I will never forget when during music class, for some fucking reason, the teacher decided that she was going to teach us like cotton picking songs. Guess what I had to hear like the rest of the time? And like it got pretty violent. Like, you know, when I didn't realize that this doesn't happen to everyone, but like I got like tackled. I was greeted with like a Sieg Heil on a daily basis. Some of the, you know, things that they said, they weren't even accurate. So like, you know, as a nerd, I just took pride in that because it just said dumb shit. And I was like, you're an idiot. But like I was racialized in this way where it was like, you are not white and therefore you're black. And then the Netherlands on top of everything has Black Pete. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but that is a horrible Christmas tradition where they literally dress up in blackface. They put on Afro wigs, red lipstick, gold earrings, and they are Santa's little helpers, really Santa's slave. And like, you know, just having people like yell that at you. And like a lot of Black kids who grew up in the Netherlands, like they're so socialized by that. Like, you know, you try to say something about it, people are like, well, just go back to Africa or, you know, leave the country. So that is kind of like what I grew up with. And then just also really weird, like, I want to say like microaggressions. Like I heard from my mother that when I was born in Bulgaria. My great grandmother held me and she was like, okay, let's just like pinch her nose so it doesn't get big. And I mean, I was like literally fresh out the womb, so I don't recall that. But like to know that that's how, like, you know, I was like that, you know, that fits, that makes a lot of sense. But then going to England first, I think that's the first time that someone like that a Black person was ever like, you know, oh, you're light skinned. Then coming to the US, I'm like, wow, like there's a whole other dimension there. And it's been really interesting just figuring out what my place is, because the way that I think about, you know, how I fit is that I'm adopted. So like the Black communities that I've met wherever, like if they fuck with me, they adopt me. And that's all I can ever really ask, right? So like that's something that works regardless of where you are. People look at you, and if they like you, they'll want to claim you. They'll say that they see something. Like, you know, I had this happen when I was in India, when I was in Nigeria to visit my relatives. There was some of them who were like, you know, oh, you look just like so-and-so. And, you know, because of how we're socialized to look at race and what phenotypes we care about and our relative framework, a lot of people will be like, you look nothing like this person because that person is like, you know, completely Black, but they see some features where they're like, no, I see how you're kin. And so, Misha, actually, based off of some of the things that you said, like that's something that, I would say is, I don't want to say like it doesn't matter what's true, but I think that kinship is so much more than your genealogical, ancestors and relatives. Like kinship can be made. And if people see a connection, I think it's worth making. And like, as somebody who has family who I can never really be connected to in Nigeria, just because like they're living in poverty. Some of them can't read, and I don't have the means to help all of them. Like that's like a huge rift that you have between people. The people that you're going to have connections with, the kinds of connections that you're going to have, they're not just going to be dictated by whether you share blood or are recent, genetic kin. And I think because of that, we have to make family, and making family shouldn't be limited, in my opinion, by the people who you can really say, okay, this is the connection that we have, because you don't know if those people are going to claim you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really want to talk about, we talk about this question of like, what are our phenotypic nicknames? And one thing that we battled with this entire season was that, by talking about these things, are we further racializing them? And how do we also wanted people to disconnect from this idea that when as Black people, when we see someone of a particular skin color, the first thing that pops up in our head is thinking about their parents' skin color and if that skin color matches. I mean, how many of y'all watched Fresh Prince when they brought out light skin Aunt Viv and we was like, nah, that ain't gonna work. You know what I mean? Or on the Cosby Show where you had Denise and oh Jesus, was it? No, Vanessa was the middle one. Denise, yeah, Denise and the oldest one,
Sandra.
Sandra, yes, who were light skinned, who had these brown skinned parents. And a lot of Black people can't conceptualize the fact that that could actually happen. But one of the things that I like that we talk about in the episode, I hope people understand, is just how complex skin color is and how unpredictable it is. And so it is very likely that you can have people of multiple shades within a family, no different that in white families you have kids with different hair colors. I mean, it literally is a very random, complicated process that involves hundreds and probably thousands of genes, not only just those genes, the interactions they have with each other and with the environment. So it's like a very, very, very complicated thing. And I hope that this episode and the last episode kind of starts to teach people that, hey, like we should be thinking much more broadly about these things, and that kind of, what Tina said, kinship is so much more than our genetics. But even if you want to talk about genetics, let's like really understand how genetics works and how you get these phenotypes within even one family. And how does that look? I know for me, I am not mixed at all. I hate when people ask, well, okay, let me not say that. I am admixed for sure, yes. But my parents both have primary African ancestry. And so I think when I was growing up, the criticism that I would get, and my parents are also like, I am in probably the Blackest family in New Orleans, right? Like people used to call us professional Africans. Like we do, yeah, all the things. And we don't just claim one part of Africa, we claim all of it, right? We run all the traditions, we naming ceremonies, all of it. And so my light skinned ass coming out of there, I used to get teased a lot, like, oh, you were adopted because my brother is darker, you were adopted. But people a lot of times only see especially in Black families, that relationship is limited to skin color. So I'm glad that you, Tina, kind of brought up the point that when you went to Nigeria, that your family members were able to look at all of your features and be connected to them and say, these other features, we can see them from, different parts. And people actually look like me. I really look so much like my dad. But under the guise of just thinking about skin color, people don't, associate it. I know when I was born, kind of talking about like horrific stories, my grandmother saw me and was like, my paternal grandmother, like, that's not Dean's baby, because I came out so fair, and I just wonder how these kind of comments and comments in the way we think about things could completely change if we really truly understand how dynamic skin color and all phenotypes are.
Right. And I even think about, and it's something that I try to impress on people often, is like how diverse the continent of Africa is, just even in one country. Like in Ghana alone, I think there's 82 languages. I think about there's like more, and bring up a phenotypic area, and I might get the area wrong, so I'm sorry to my Ghanaian friends who are watching. But there's like a certain part of Ghana in central Ghana where everybody has like a gap tooth. And I find that their faces look the same too, right? And then phenotypically, like that's something that's seen as a sign of beauty. In Ghana, it's like when women have a gap in their teeth, right? And then I think about another like innocent to moving to Rwanda for the first time was have all kinds of dating stories around phenotype, but in particular, this guy being like, "Oh, you're as beautiful as a cow," and me thinking like, "Are you calling me a heifer?" Or like, literally, are you calling me a heifer? Like, or him saying, "Oh, your gums are dark like a cow," but then learning that like, and then actually getting a. So I used to work for the First Lady of Rwanda, and so they gave me a Rwandan name, and it's Mukamisha, which technically Mu is a person, Ka is like a little thing, and then Misha is like a girl who milks the cow. And so instead of saying Tamisha, they wanted to call me Mukami and Mukamisha, and like give me a name there. And so at first I was like very much like, why is everything here around cows? But I didn't know how important cows were. And then me being from Texas, they were like, oh, longhorns. And then anchovy cows in East Africa are like a really big deal. Like, so people who are pastoralists really revere cow. And so like even there's like milk bars in Rwanda and just all kind of fascinating things. So for me, it was really a process of, I don't know that I think I come from a family that like literally just celebrates whatever part of Black you are. Like don't care about what shade you are, whatever. But going to Africa and then seeing that be kind of reverse, whatever it was about you, whether that's your hair, your gap in your tooth, your gums, and then comparing that to something like in nature versus something that's like, I don't know. But I find that like Black folks do that around the world. So I find that really interesting. I think we lost Jordan. There we go. Jordan, I know you had a comment about, I don't know if we can hear you, something about like your height and something that you wanted to add about that. No.
Maybe.
I might be telling the story wrong, but Jordan absolutely despises when people assume that he should play basketball, particularly because he's tall, or that like that's the sport that he has to play. Okay.
Well, it's funny you should say that because we have an episode on that. We are going to be talking about the genetics of athleticism in episode 5. So we will address we will address that. And we also, in episode 6, we'll be talking about the genetics of body shape. So we'll be also talking about how, so we'll be talking about both of those things. I don't know, Tina and Brandon, if there's anything evolutionary benefit of being tall, because you have certain populations in Europe that are tall.
Girl, I have so many. So I'm not saying sexual selection is fake, but I am saying that evolutionary psychologists sometimes get a little carried away with fan fiction, and they make extrapolations. But one of the things that comes up a lot about height is how, oh, it must have been selected because women are like, taller men. Now, I have had to pull girlfriends, like, from the edge and ask, girl, I will shake you. Do you like him or is he just tall? And 10 times out of 10, it's just because he's tall. I'm sure he has other qualities as well, but like, being tall, I have seen it with my own eyes, the power that it imbues people with. There are some tall guys who get away with literally not even having a personality, and they can get by because they're tall. Now, what that means, like, historically, I don't know. But what we've learned over the last, I want to say, like 100 years about the genetics of height is that there's a lot of it that is complicated in terms of its interaction with the environment. Because with Korea, for example, the Netherlands, even like the US, you see how height changed before and after World War II. And in some populations, like after wars and famines, like, whoop, all of a sudden they're super tall. And the speed at which the population height increases is way faster than any genetic change could ever, go through the population. So we know that there's got to be some element of, like how your genetic expression, so like, how your genes are actually being used, that's different. So I don't know if Brandon wants to add anything to that with his 5'11" self.
I beg your pardon? 5'11", 6'1". Anyway, so so the evolutionary benefit of height, of being high. So what I'll quickly say is this, right? Are there adaptations to certain types of environments that might have been beneficial, and might those things correlate with certain heights? I think that's the right. So it may not be the height. It might be something about, right, some other kind of biomechanical thing or some kind of other physiological thing. It's not the height itself. That's number one. Number two, a point that Tina just made beautifully, which is the way height changes from country to country. I think the you'll get there's the tallest countries. There's Northern Europe and then like Eastern Europe, which to the sports question, Dr. Jeff, I hope you get into this during the sports conversation. This is why you like the number of Eastern Europeans in the NBA. So it's one of the world. So as you see that, that's not the case because it's evolutionary advantage to be tall. That doesn't make any sense. Like why would that from an adaptive perspective doesn't make sense. And then lastly, this point, it really is culture. Just like with skin color, that gives these things their presumptive social benefits in time. It's things that we do. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Are there any other things? We were going to do a fact or fiction, but we'll just let y'all say the facts. Are there any other things outside of hair, thinking of Tina and her wigs and the robots, that are advantageous, I guess, for Black folks outside of kinky hair?
So there is one hypothesis, and I'm putting it out there as a hypothesis. Actually, a friend of mine did some work on nose shape variation across the world. And basically from what he found, he said that it is possible that there might be some kind of adaptation to climate because the way that you take in air, like, that's all affected by humidity, like not just like, hot or cold, but also humidity and all of these things. But that's like where things get really interesting, right? Because we associate a certain nose shape with Blackness, but when you look on the other side of the continent to a lot of Ethiopians and Somali people, that's where also the whole discussion comes of like, whether they're really Black or not. At the end of the day, that's not the question, because we're all Black, like everyone's equally African. But what's even more interesting is that these noses that we associate with Black people, like you also have Europeans with pretty, broad noses. And especially like in Southeast Asia, there's multiple populations where, if you don't see their hair, some people are like, oh, I thought that they were Black. And that, just goes to show you like, this distribution of these different phenotypes, it doesn't align with what we think of in terms of race actually at all.
And I think it's actually important not to do that. I think the Rwandan genocide would be a reason not to. And so that would be my hope for people, is like to learn from that. I think about how the Belgians and Dutch used like phenotypical things to separate both Tutsi and Hutu populations from each other in Burundi, Congo, Rwanda, all of that. Won't get super into that, but I just think about like how much hate, or even like thinking about, won't get into this one either, but the curse of Ham in the Bible, and the controversial whether Black people were meant to be enslaved, or to use the Bible or like some kind of phenotypic characterization as a justification for slavery, or any kind of human atrocity. Let's just say that. I see Brandon's face.
I think that you're actually bringing up a really important point, and I just wanted to add to that it's really important to be aware of that, because anything can be exploited. It does not matter. Like, people have picked, like when I was in Europe and I was like, redheads are discriminated against, LOL, sure. Holy shit. Yes, that was a thing. And I was like, you have all these Black and brown people to pick on around the world, and you were like, nah, these redheaded cousins, that's who we're gonna fuck with. But like, obviously in Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide, especially in South Africa, these, differences were being pit against each other. So it can be, and I've seen it happen online sometimes, it can be tempting to, take certain things and like be like, oh, okay, like we have this and it's a Black trait, and the people who don't have this are bad, or whatever, they're not as good. But I've seen it happen with things like Neanderthal ancestry, and people will be like, oh, that's why Europeans are so backwards, because they have Neanderthal ancestry. But what people then forget is that there are also Black Australians and Melanesians who have Neanderthal ancestry, and the cost of one-upping Europeans and putting them down is potentially bringing down another marginalized population. So, I just completely agree with you, and we should just very much avoid that, because it always backfires.
Brandon, feel like you're holding back. You got something to say?
Nah, I'm just, I'm saying, just feeling the vibes. That's all.
Okay. I saw your facial expression over there. Janine, did you have something to add to that before?
No,
I was going to ask you something else.
I was interested in your fact or fiction, but a question that I have, and this is a question that I did not ask during the episode, but I'm curious to hear Tina and Brandon's take on it, is that is some type of taxonomy classification a part of being human? Meaning that if we did not have race, would we just pick another thing?
We already did, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know I'm not Brandon or Tina, but I would say like, I think it's class or like socioeconomic standing would be like our second, because I see that a lot in Africa specifically. Mm-hmm. It's no longer like, what skin color you are, because most of the people wear some shade of Black, brown, whatever color we identify with. But it becomes a thing of like, what school you went to, or which church you belong to, or whatever else. How many cows you have.
Mm-hmm. Tina, you want to go first? Dr. Lasisa, you first or me first? All right. What I will say is that is a phrase from the writer Natalie Angier, who wrote this really beautiful book about the biology of females called Women. And I remember in the book, she called Homo sapiens the incorrigible categorizers. And she said, we're always going to do something of this nature. Key is this. It's not that. So I think that humans will always categorize. The question is, what are those categories and how leaky are the boundaries between them? Right. That's the fundamental question. Right. As in, right. How hard are the boundaries? So I don't like Red Sox fans, for example. I've actually almost gotten into fistfights with Red Sox fans, and I do think they are lesser than Yankee fans. However, I do also recognize that that's a silly category, and that's not a real way to organize anything about the species. And I think, so my point is, so categorical thinking is human. I think it helps us understand the world in a lot of ways. The key is that when it comes to race, what it's done is that it's formed these artificial hard boundaries, and all it essentially does is allow us to justify treating each other differently. So yes, we'll always have categories. The question is, what are those categories, and how leaky are the boundaries between them?
Mm-hmm. And what do we do with those categories? Because I personally, I mean, it's a constant struggle for me because, you know, I want to be like, burn down all the categories, but there's something about the way that we understand things and the way that we have to communicate things. Like, yeah, like you could probably write a bunch of algorithms that, you know, don't have to categorize things. Like, you know, they can understand clusters and multiple dimensions and all of that. But, you know, our brains can't, and we tend to look at one thing at a time. And we can look at one thing and be like, this is sort of like, you know, a rough, you know, categorization of this, but knowing that it's not, you know, essential, it's not permanent. That's the important thing, because, you know, there people will say like race was the problem, and in the same breath they will reinvent race using the words ethnicity. Like, I have seen tons of people say this, and, you know, I'm just like, you will keep reinventing it, because if you're going to pick what people look like and what their ancestry is, it doesn't matter what the word is that you're using for it. And I think that there's a lot of forms of categorization that we use for like extreme things that are widely accepted, like you know, ableism. There's a lot of happy eugenics talks when people are like, oh, well, people who have this kind of disease or this condition, or people who are mentally ill, shouldn't be allowed to have kids. How do you categorize somebody as mentally ill? What makes it about them that is inherently bad? Like, these are the questions we need to ask ourselves. It's not that any one classification system was the problem, but that any classification system where you're able to make judgments about who is superior or inferior, they're all dangerous, because people will use and exploit anything that they can to get rid of people that they don't like because they're petty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And on the, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think about this idea of classification versus hierarchy, which I think is kind of what you were describing. Like, it's okay to classify. It gets problematic when we start to politicize it and then start to say one is better than the other. But then when you look at other species, you see some forms of hierarchy too. And so I get real hung up on, is that even that part a part of being human? This is a very dangerous conversation. I just want to also say that. So I'm not subscribing to any of this. I'm just
like, what do you like? Do you have social hierarchies or
social hierarchies? Yeah. I mean, with that have significant, in some cases, consequences.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But so this is the interesting thing, right? Like, there's certain fluidities, and like people have talked about this in relation to what made chattel slavery in the Americas so much more violent than previous forms of slavery. There was this ability to make it like a permanent thing, whereas in certain other cases, like, you know, that's a status that could change over time. Like, you know, your people's wasn't necessarily doomed to this forever. And I think with a lot of social hierarchies in animals, it's like, this generation you're the boss, but next generation, who knows? And that, like, you know, there's certain stakes there that are, I would say, not as high. I'm not saying that it's good or bad, but the scary thing about humans is that we're able to consolidate power in a way that we can literally wipe out everyone else if we wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, what I'd say is, you look around, you look to our closest relatives, you see these really frightening hierarchies, right? And the idea is, oh my, if these people are, if this species is close to us, does that mean that they're natural within Homo sapiens? And I think in Homo sapiens is this constant debate about what's natural. And I think what's beautiful about the species ultimately is we get to define what is natural. This conversation here with all these brilliant women, right, is not less natural than a plantation is, or less natural than a fiefdom is. Homo sapiens, you have a choice. You get a chance to choose. This is why this conversation feels so good and natural. So I think that's my quick take on that, Janina.
Yeah, I was going to ask if any of it was or any of these classifications or justifications actually like useful, like in particular when it comes to like science and thinking of like the future of genetics and precision medicine and all those kind of things. And one of the fact or fictions where was around sickle cell anemia. Like, are Black people the only people that, like, if we're not Black, right? Like, if race is a construct and we're not Black, playing devil's advocate, not really, then are Black people the only people who can get sickle cell anemia? Or, like, why do groups of people who are racialized as Black have a higher incidence of sickle cell anemia than other people?
Yeah, the short answer is no. Not Black people are not the only people who can have sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a response, a selective response to being resistant to malaria. And so literally anyone who lives close to the equator that has exposure to malaria could develop sickle cell trait and or sickle cell anemia. We talk about this in the episode around the Solomon Islanders and blonde hair. This is a different kind of phenotype. Like sickle cell is definitely something that is driven by selection, but Tina educated us so eloquently on blonde hair and blue eyes that you see in other parts of the world outside of Europe that, from what we understand, and Tina, correct me if I'm wrong, developed independent of any type of European ancestry, developed at random. And this can happen too. That may not have something directly to do with the environment. Maybe not at random. I think it was Tina, you explained it, but from what I understand, it was also a matter of lack of admixture, I should say.
Yeah. So like there's a number of things, right? Drift. And so basically when groups of people have kids with each other and there's not a lot of external gene flow, sometimes you get some weird genes that are not really doing anything, but they're not hurting anybody, that just become very, very common. And that's one way that things happen. And the other is selection, as Janina was saying. And then that's what we see with sickle cell trait. And then not all Black populations have a high rate of sickle cell trait because not all Black populations are in places where there's a lot of malaria and then there's worth having protection against. And so what's really interesting about sickle cell trait and sickle cell anemia is that it's one of these, honestly, I want to say rare, like Brandon, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it's very rare that you have a trait where if you have 2 copies of a particular gene, it's very dangerous. Like actually having sickle cell anemia is really, really dangerous. But having sickle cell trait, you have this trade-off where you have one of each, and so you are protected. You don't quite have the full trait, but you have enough that you're less likely to get sick from malaria. And actually, as a fun personal anecdote, my dad found out super late in his life that he had sickle cell traits. So he had like, the one of each. And it was actually really, I don't know, I want to say like weirdly emotional. Like when I explained that to him and he was like, oh, that's probably why like his mother lost so many kids. Like they didn't know why some of them didn't make it. And it was probably because some of them had, 2 copies and they had the sickle cell anemia and it wasn't something that you could treat. So it's one of those things where, evolution can be very cruel. Like it helps enough people that it becomes common, and those who suffer from it, they suffer.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things I was going to ask about was I remember taking, I think, biological anthropology or something in school. And we were talking about, I think, an episode where Oprah had Dr. Oz on. And they were talking about Black people and hypertension and that Black folks have a higher incidence of hypertension because we survive the transatlantic trade. Because we have more salt in our body, and that makes us more susceptible to hypertension. So is that fact or fiction?
So it's, go ahead.
Please.
I mean, it's mostly fiction, but I mean, there are some scientists who have been trying to show this, and I don't know if this is the same thing he was talking about, but I've mostly heard it called the thrifty gene hypothesis, but not really connected to the transatlantic slave trade, more so connected. Oh, that's the slave hypertension hypothesis. I've never heard of that one, but more so connected to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. And you can think about it similar to the way that our ability to metabolize lactose. And so that's how I have heard of that connection. But there's a lot of debate on how true that is. So not a lot of strong evidence there, but yeah.
Data are extremely weak for that hypothesis. And I think it's one of those things that the reason why those types of hypotheses in particular are so pernicious is that they have the dressing of an empowering thing. The idea is that we survived this trip and we're stronger. It made us stronger to be able to survive. When in fact, all that does is excuse away all the things that actually give us hypertension in contemporary settings. And this came up in the COVID disparity. It's the same debate played out in the COVID disparity, right? Like, there's got to be a gene. It's got to be a gene. It's got to be a gene. And what do we know now? It's like access and discrimination and these things that we actually have control over. So we have to be very, very, very careful about adaptive hypothesis as a whole. In fact, even sickle cell anemia is actually more complicated a story. It's actually not a neatly cutesy little Mendelian thing quite the way we thought it was. So I think you look more closely at any genetic story, and there's going to be kind of like some knobs and some like, whoa, it's not quite that simple, that shake out of it. Oh, and by the way, I'm gonna have to leave soon, by the way. So if I vanish, I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah, we're gonna wrap up in just a second. I wanted you all to address, on the same vein that we're on right now, Janina's question, I guess one from Instagram. How does generational trauma play into genomics?
So spoiler alert. I was going to say we are doing an episode on this, but go ahead, Tina.
So I was gonna say, I don't know what's gonna be on that episode, so I'd say definitely tune in for that, for the specifics. But actually, to tie that to something that Brandon said, there is a lot of people talking recently about how, oh, it's intergenerational trauma and it's because of epigenetics and methylation, and that's why I'm suffering. It can have a lot of the parallels of the slave hypertension hypothesis, where on face value, you're thinking like, oh, like, you know, this is legitimizing, you know, like this is validating, this is why we suffer. But what it ultimately ends up doing is naturalizing it and making it inevitable and basically inscribed in your genes that you are meant to suffer. The reality of the sciences, and I'm sure that Janina is going to echo this, like we're learning a lot about processes, like new ways that biology can work that's not simply your genetic code, how you inherited it. And that's wonderful. But it is very, very dangerous to try and turn that into a simplistic explanation. And it is something that can very easily be turned against Black people.
Well, looks like we got a lot of really good conversations coming up. I'm going to try to unmute Jordan. Janine, you wanted to add something?
I was just gonna say I cringe when I hear this question. I try to start answering this question by explaining how complicated epigenetics is, because nobody really understands that part, which is a really big part. Like, how do you measure inherited epigenetics? And also kind of going into why is it, and this season started out like this, where we were talking about what should the season be about, and we kept centering on the question, well, why is it that we want these things to be genetic? Why is it that we are digging for an answer? Because we cannot simply just accept the cruelty of oppression due to race. That is a hard pill for us to swallow. And so you have the thrifty gene hypothesis, the slave hypertension hypothesis, the post-traumatic slave disorder hypothesis, and epigenetics, all these things being in, because we're trying to there has to be a logical answer why y'all treat us like this. Like, there has to be something bigger. And I think it's very risky because we're doing the same thing that the scientists who created race are doing. We are trying to create a pseudoscience to help explain the trauma that we receive that actually probably more than likely has nothing to do with genetics. Probably does have an interaction between genetics and our psychology, perhaps, maybe, but like even that's a long stretch. So, really sitting and thinking, why is our trauma such a focal point, and why are we bringing it into so many different disciplines, including science, and try and check that. On the contrary, to change the conversation, whenever we're asking a question in science, we also have to ask an opposing question. And so if we are asking this question about generational trauma, we should also be asking the question about generational joy. And that kind of just further, drives home the point. That conversation is not being had. And one of the reasons why is because we are focused on the trauma, right? And so we really just have to kind of start to separate our own, oppression or trauma due to oppression from science. And I mean, this is something that happens in this episode too, that we tried to make sure. One thing I'll say, and I don't know if anyone is listening, there was one word we did not use in this episode that we were very careful about not using in this episode. Did anyone figure it out?
Is it black?
We not use the word race.
Uh,
The entire episode, yeah.
why was that?
More so because we do use it in other episodes, but particularly in this episode coming after the last one, we just got finished learning that race is a social construct that's not based in science. And so in order to kind of diminish the word and kind of remove the word from science, we have to stop using it. Even if it is something that we do use to describe, we try to be very careful about that. And so we used other words like classification based on a caste system. We use certain words like, well, I think one thing that I do, and Tina, I'm not sure, I definitely delineate race from genetic ancestry, and race from, I remove race from when I talk about phenotypes in general, and kind of center it on, our ancestors and the environments they lived in.
I mean, absolutely. Like, it also just made a lot of sense because, like, what we ended up talking about is, because we talked about Hoteps when we talked about the Solomon Islanders with the blonde hair. It's like, we made room for there to be variation where we have an implicit understanding, like your audience has an implicit understanding, but that implicit understanding isn't like solidified and, constrained. There was room for us to be like, hey, there's these other people who people say look like us. And we didn't say we're all Black. And we just said like, hey, we share these phenotypes. And that's like a much more accurate reflection of the biology and the genetics than, any kind of category we could use.
Yeah, I'm starting to wonder. And so I studied, I'm like, this sounds so crazy. But I studied like post-conflict transformation. So I went to Rwanda to look at like how society transforms after a human atrocity such as a genocide. So I was thinking about like the ways in which it could be useful to organize to have some kind of outcome. Like maybe that's why people are trying to piece these things together. So like if you can show, because one of the biggest things I learned is that in order to have a genocide, it has to be against a certain group of people. Like it can't be like, it has to be like, yes, otherwise not genocide, right? So, and that was like a big mind flip for me and like thinking about it and some other things that they said and like, okay, if this happened to you, then you're going to have a set of like psychosocial support that you need that will automatically be included in how you exist from here on out. A set of like health and just thinking about like all those kind of things, how it might be useful. But that was, I think, a big question that I had too, like what does the future look like without these kind of distinctions? Or like, what do you think should exist in the future? What would you like to see in the future for both of y'all?
So I'm glad you made that connection because that was the biggest thing that I was going to say. It's like people are, it's not exactly the same, but it's kind of when people say like, oh, my weight is genetic. Like the reason that I'm this way is genetic. Like they couldn't point to like a single study that explains exactly how it's genetic, but the reason they say that is to say, like, don't judge me for it, or this is natural, when that is never going to protect them. And that's the same thing for anything that we find in biology to validate, corroborate what was done wrong to Black people in the US. Like, you'll never get justice using those tools, right? And so it's basically what I think is, like, hoping that you can find like a fair referee and be like, hey, look, we have all of this evidence, but that's not something that it is going to happen with the help of science, right? And I feel like you, Misha, would actually know a lot better, like, what this means. I feel like people need to think really critically about the ways we can define it using law and history, because I'm like, there are very, legitimate reasons that you can go through for why, certain people need to have reparations. Because, right, this is also like a conversation that happens in the US. Like, Janina, I never took your M index, but hypothetically, if me and Janina are exactly the same skin color, like, I don't have the same history as Janina, right? So, like, she should not be judged in the same way that I am, and it's because we have particular histories. And that needs to be taken into account more than anything else, because in a lot of ways, when people think about kinship and ethnicity and ancestry in that sense, those are the units where people, like, experience things in community. And that is what I, like, would perceive as being like a comparable case to what you may have seen in Rwanda.
Yes. Jordan, I think. Yes. Say hopefully. Can we hear you?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me for one.
I think you have to unmute.
It's been a while. Yeah, I'm curious to think about, because I think this is really interesting on the here and now. And we've obviously touched a bit on the past and how phenotype, how we look, has shaped our experience. I'm curious because recently there was a Easter egg drop of a bonus episode on how these things affect Black people going forward, the way that we look, how will we look, and how that affects our lived experience going forward in the future.
Yes, so that's exactly what I was going to tell everyone to tune into the bonus episode we dropped yesterday. So that bonus episode was actually an extension of this episode. The original episode was over an hour long. And we had a segment where, after we had traveled to the Americas, we go 15,000 years into the future. And one of the reasons why we chose 15,000 years was to also give perspective on how long evolution takes to see significant changes in who we are. It started out because Hotep's be saying that we gonna all be brown skinned, and 50 years we all gonna be Mexican. We all gonna look Mexican, And we actually talked about that, Brandon, Tina, and I, of like why that's not true, but really wanted to drive home the point of why that's not true and why it's very unlikely also. And so in this episode where we go 15,000 years in the future, we bring along Yatasha Womack, who is an Afrofuturist. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with her work. If you're not, you should definitely get familiar with her work. And imagined a world full of technology, but also full of culture and full of, space travel, all kinds of things that we, like, socially are so, normal for us now, but may not really be a part of who we are later. And so it was a great voyage into the future. We talked about the same things that we talked about in the episode with Tina and Brandon, and they're in this little clip as well. Most notably, Tina's light reflectings that are pink were in this episode. But yeah, so we definitely play around with the futures. And I think one of the things about the show in general that is just really important to us is that we as Black people not only think about our genetics as being a tool for understanding our past, but most importantly, a tool for understanding our future. And that we start to recenter our framework on seeing ourselves in the future, which unfortunately is somewhat a part of our oppression. And so we definitely want to dismantle that and imagine those worlds. And like Tina said, you have so many other mediums that are also doing that. And I think it's just such a positive thing.
All right. Well, I think the future will be our stopping point for now. This has been amazing. Tina, how, or Dr. Lasisi, how can we support you moving forward? Or where can people find out? Oh, your TikTok, right? Tell us more
I'm
about your
on
TikTok.
all of the
She's
social
famous
medias
for all the social
under
media.
Tina Lasisi. I'm kidding. I'm not famous, but y'all can make me famous. So I don't know, follow me. And the last thing I just want to say is just want to put out there, I'm like, Jordan, I would like you to know, in case you didn't read in the chat, you have a very, very beautiful brow ridge. I just want you to know that.
Thank you.
For the people who don't know, what's a brow ridge?
I mean, if you wouldn't mind parting your hair, it's basically that right there above the eyebrow. It's just, I love that feature. Love it.
Thank you. Shout out to the ancestors.
Hey.
And actually, on that note, and for the notes on this talk, we'll include more info. But for those seeking to understand, I guess more recently, why we look the way we look and how we got here, obviously, you can also understand more about that through family history research, because my eyes bothering me now. But you can understand more by finding information in records like the census, like World War draft cards, Civil War pension files, where there's descriptions and sometimes photos of our ancestors that give that additional context. So we'll drop more resources after this episode and after I get my eye together. But so thankful for this discussion. If you haven't already, please catch up on In Those Genes. There's more great episodes coming this season. If you haven't watched the first season, do that as well. One question that I was going to ask was around genetic tests in the future. So we talked about genetic testing in the here and now, but also really quick interested on getting your thoughts on how those look and or maybe should look in the future. I know that you, Dr. Jeff, you dropped some gems in season 1, but for those who haven't listened and tuned in, what are your thoughts on genetic testing in the future?
I think genetic testing in the future is going to be so normalized that we won't even call it genetic testing. Like, it's literally going to be your identity going forward. And I don't see that being 15,000 years in the future. I actually see that being somewhere like 20 years in the future, where genetic testing would be no different than a birth certificate, form of identity, social security card. I think genetic testing is going to replace all of that. Genetic testing and biometrics. Now, I don't know if it's ethical. Now, that's a whole nother conversation. But I do think that, I don't know if anyone has ever seen the movie Gattaca. I do think that that will be, what is your question? Said, does that mean what?
I was just saying, does that mean that you've now done one of these genetic tests? Because I remember that you hadn't done one before.
No, I still have not done a direct-to-consumer genetic test, but I am in the process of writing a book. It's a very long process, so don't check in on it. And a part of the things that I'm doing in writing is sequencing my genome. And so, yeah, I have done my first genetic test earlier this year. And for whatever reason, they decided to report back my genetic ancestry, but I did not ask for it. It was a carrier screening test. I did not ask for my genetic ancestry to be reported back, but they did report it back to me. It was very high level. But yes, I have never contributed to a direct-to-consumer test. That being said, I don't really see those tests as being here in the future. Like, I actually see all the work and things that we're learning, one, are going to be expanded way beyond genetics. So it won't be just your genetic test. It'll be your genetic test plus your environment and all your biometrics and all of the cultural things that make up who you are, that will try to promote your likelihood of developing disease. But then in 20 years, 30 years, maybe 50 years, you will have so much advancement in genetic technologies, particularly around genetic engineering, that is really going to shake shit up. I mean, it's going to shake up evolution. It's going to shake up, oh my God, if y'all think plastic surgery is bad, just wait on it. So I think it's going to be very broad, and there's so many different directions it could go. But I think the most logical first step is, I think that we all will be probably whole genome sequencing will be something very, very normal. And learning about our DNA is going to be very similar to how we learn about how to spell our name. So that's what I think a future will look like. But
so just to plug, based on the future thing, for my future lab, I think one of the most important things is going to be to make sure that, you know, we as Black people all around the world are empowered to do the research. Because if it's in the hands of other people, they will never have our interests at heart. And so my thing is, I want us to make some of the same moves that especially Indigenous American geneticists have done to, like, you know, create resources so that we can have more, you know, PhD students, more researchers who are involved in this work so that we can be advocating for us everywhere. And that is absolutely possible. And, you know, like, that is something that I'm willing to dedicate the rest of my career to. So, you know, if anybody's interested or has, like, you know, a little cousin who in a few years time will want to do a PhD, let me know.
yes, I just love that. Yes, all that. We need to be the ones behind this.
Right. I'm like, okay, so what day do we start? I was like, we got some things. Wow. I'm like, I had another question, but I'm not gonna ask it. I was gonna ask you what genetics looks like in the metaverse, but that'll be another conversation.
That's a good question.
Facebook
What's
thing?
No.
Yeah, virtual.
Yeah,
What are you?
no.
You're talking about? You're talking about?
I mean, in like Web3, not necessarily
Oh.
like what Facebook is trying to trademark as theirs, but let me not say that because we're on their platform. But in Web3, in the future, what that will look like.
What does genetic look like? I mean, I am excited about the educational parts of the metaverse.
True.
One of the things that I think social media has done has had made particularly science more accessible because of video and because of visualization. So I can only imagine that going to an even bigger level with the metaverse. I definitely see more people being interested in science. Now, the unfortunate part about any technology is that technology is always going to be biased by the creators. And so, unfortunately, those creators, I don't know, but I'm gonna imagine they probably not all Black, if at all. Yeah, I don't know. Unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong. But that being said, I could already see there's going to be some issues, biases, things in the metaverse that we're going to have to correct anyway. So I do think there's going to be a lot of positive, just like social media has been very positive for marginalized communities, especially with genetics education and conceptualizing things. Like, I don't know about you, Tina, but it took me so long to understand the concept of this statistical concept of principal components until I could really see it in 3-dimensional space. And I was like, this shit makes sense.
Where the hell are you doing stats in 3D? Let me get on that Illumina education.
Well, I don't know. Like, I used to see PC plots. It made sense to me. I understood it. But I really understood it once I saw the 3-dimensional ones. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
No, I feel left out.
I will send you a plot. I do a seminar class with GenSpace where I teach genetic ancestry, and I help them make that plot, because once you see a dot in 3-dimensional PC space, you're like, oh, now it makes sense, like how you exist in this data. So anyway, that being said, things like that in the metaverse will probably be really make things like, you know, complicated statistical concepts seem more realistic and applicable. So I'm excited about what it will look like for education.
Yeah, but not to be the Debbie Downer. I think one of the biggest concerns I have, and just in general, I'm like, oh, I know the science is gonna go forward, but like, what's politics gonna do? Like, are we gonna implode? Like, we've seen literally in these last, and I cannot believe it, 2 years, that even with miracles from science, people fumble the bag. And we know that they're going to do that again. And so one of the scary things about, scary, but like, you know, important things about social media is that the way that it works is that it wants us all to act as individuals. So this is me glossing over it. But like if you divide everyone and you kind of want people to act in their own best interest and not think critically, people will behave in particular ways. But if you see people forming communities and saying like, okay, this is how we're going to talk about our interests, this is what we think is acceptable or not, we see a lot more positive things come out of that. So I would say that's the most important thing moving forward, is to make sure that we continue having community and making community, and not just letting social media try and like divide us into units of profit.
Yeah, and that's with everything. Like, that's the scariest part about everything. Precision medicine, everything. COVID. Like, I tell people all the time, COVID is a great example of how politics and science can interact. Like, if these developing variants is not a political genetic interaction, I don't know what is.
Scary stuff. Scary stuff. So going forward, now I know we just talked about the future, but within those genes, where are we headed next? We just kind of left on phenotype. We touched on race before that. What's next? What's coming up next?
Next, you get to hear Tina again in episode 3. Tina's so amazing and knows so much about so many things. We hit her up again and asked her to join us on episode 3, where we talk about aging. We also will talk about we talk with someone who I went to graduate school with, Marquita White. And I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but one really important thing about our show is that every voice you hear on the show is a Black voice that comes from an expert. So you are going to learn all about so many Black scientists and sociologists and music ethnologists and so many different things. But next episode is going to be, it's called Black Don't Crack. And it's going to be on the genetics of aging. And it just occurred to me that I did not invite our nonagenarian to our In Our DNA after show. So I have to hit her up and see if she is available. I'm sure she would love to join on our next show. And hopefully we have you back, Tina and Marquita. So in that episode, we'll be talking about how we age, and it's going to be a fun episode, very Magic School bus-esque. So you will hear skits. These times the skits will be cells, so it will be fun. It'll be fun. We hope you enjoy it, but we're going to be learning about the genetics of aging. So that's what we have to look forward to next, and hopefully everyone will join.
Awesome. Definitely looking forward to it. Like I mentioned before, if you're not caught up on In Those Genes, they're on wherever you digest your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, you name it, they're there. You can go to inthosegenes.com. We've also linked them on our website at kinkofa, kinkofa.com/NRDNA. Definitely get caught up before this next episode. Excited for that next conversation. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Misha, as well, for this amazing conversation. Thank you, Brandon. And yeah, any closing thoughts, statements, recommendations?
I'm going to make sure everybody is up to date on what we got going on too. So we are currently building the future of genealogy. We'll tell you more about that at one point. But in order to do that, we want to make sure we have input from the people that look like us and that we're building with. So I'm going to drop the link for that in the chat. And then next week, next Wednesday, we'll be telling y'all about how we're building the future of genomics, but genealogy, not well, maybe we are doing both. But we'll be talking about that next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And if you have another time, can't help you. But make sure you're signed up for that. You can find out about that at kinkofa.com. It'll be in the chats. And thank you all for watching. Janina and Tina, I don't know if you'll have any closing remarks.
I just want to thank you and Jordan for holding this space and continuing to create community every week. It's been fun, good conversation. So we're just so grateful for you guys for hosting this, and and yeah, creating community with us.
Yeah, seconded. Thank you so much. It was so great meeting you.
Likewise.
Likewise. So bye, y'all. We'll give it a second to cut off. We'll see y'all next time. Happy